All right, so remember in the first video for this module, I mentioned how there are problems in both how we think and in with what we think, right? The basic idea is that there's two different kinds of obstacles to good critical thinking or good critical reasoning. One obstacle is just with regard to how we think, the psychological obstacles that we spent most of this module addressing so far. And then there's also this point about what we think, right? When we are evaluating or judging different propositions or different beliefs that we may have, we have to pay attention to the actual content of what that belief is, right? If I believe that the earth is flat, there's maybe a problem with how I formed that belief or why I believe it, but I also need to look at the content of that belief to judge and evaluate what evidence is there for that belief. So that's what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some of these obstacles to what we think because these things very much influence our ability to think critically on a number of different subjects. And so the way that I've got this broken down is, for the most part, it follows what Vaughan says in the chapter, but there's a couple of additional points that I want to include as well. But let's just begin here with this notion of different philosophical worldviews. So the basic idea is that we already have different sorts of views on the world or different ways of approaching the world. We kind of have baggage that we bring with us when we start doing critical thinking, right? So maybe one person is an atheist, and so they don't believe in God. They're not a religious person at all. Well, that particular belief may be influencing, without them even realizing it, all sorts of different other beliefs that they have or different decisions that they make. Maybe they decide to go to a particular college because that college is filled with other like-minded people who are very secular in their ways of thinking. Or maybe you do believe in God. Maybe you are a very religious person. Maybe this is a deep fundamental part of the way you approach the world, what you do, the fact that you may pray on a number of different occasions throughout the day, right? So that also could be influencing the different things that you believe, different ways in which you approach the world, the different decisions that you make throughout your life. Right. So that's just one example, but there's lots of these, lots of different philosophical ways of approaching the world that we may not even be directly aware of. And here, philosophical is that word is really doing a lot of general work. I'm not suggesting that you have to be a philosopher or have taken any particular philosophy class at all to have various philosophical worldviews. Maybe, for instance, maybe you've never even thought about these things very much at all. But if somebody asks, you could probably give some sort of an answer, or at least it's something that you may have thought about at some point in your life. Whether they're big issues and big questions about life, like, what happens when you die, whether God exists, whether you have a soul, or if they're just rather mundane things like, whether it's better to go to the movies or to watch a movie at home. So these are the types of views that are influencing the way you engage with the world around you. Take, for instance, some people believe that human beings are by nature morally corrupt. We're by nature sinful, or we're by nature the sorts of things that are selfish. We always want what's best for ourselves. That might be influencing your decision and how you engage with the people around you, the different decisions you make throughout your life. Or perhaps you believe that human beings are, inherently good. That most of us, even though some of us are not, most of us want to help people. We want to, be good and to do what we can to make the world a better place. That we're born good. And maybe it's only society that like influences people and makes them bad or evil later in life. Or maybe you're someone that believes that capitalism is the best sort of economic system that the world has, that maybe there's problems with it, but it's the best that we have. Or you might be thinking to yourself, no, capitalism is terrible, right? It's a horrible economic system, and that causes a lot of strife and a lot of harms. Right? So these are the types of things that might be operational in the background when you're making decisions in your life. They may be influencing what you think about certain issues without you ever even realizing it. So it's important to pay attention to these things when we can, right? To try to call them to mind, to become aware of them, and recognize how they might be influencing the different choices we make or the different things that we believe. Now, a more specific example here is this notion of skepticism. There's lots of different ways that we can understand what we mean by skepticism, but it's basically the idea that someone either doesn't have knowledge or maybe that knowledge is not even possible. So skepticism goes all the way back to the Greeks, if not well before the Greeks. But again, the basic idea is it's this questioning whether or not, or doubting whether or not we have knowledge in some particular thing. So I think some version of this happens a lot, especially students oftentimes will question, well, how do we even really know that in the first place? For instance, I had a student in an introduction to philosophy class just recently who came up to me after class and said, so we've been talking about Socrates and Plato, but how do we know that they even existed? And so my response immediately was, well, we've got some reason to believe that they existed, or at least, they're a character in these stories. And the student said to me, well, what do you mean by a character? And I said, well, Plato was writing in dialogue. So Socrates was essentially a character in one of these dialogues. And he said to me, so are you saying that Socrates never existed? And I was like, well, there was probably somebody named Socrates that these characters are based upon, but essentially we're dealing with a dialogue where we're talking about characters within the dialogue. And so the student said to me, so is this all just a big fiction? And I was like, well, it's a dialogue. So, in a sense, yes, it is a fiction, but it's supposed to help us understand these deeper truths. And he said, well, what is philosophy? Is philosophy all just a bunch of fiction? And you can see how this like started going down the rabbit hole of like this sort of skepticism about what can we know, how can we know any of this at all. And so it took a little bit of explaining to him, and I think he finally got it. But it does seem like we can find ourselves doubting pretty much anything. We can find ourselves in a position where we question how much we really know, right? I mean, how do I know that the physical external world actually exists? I could be dreaming all these things. I could be, influenced by an evil demon, or I could be a brain in a vat, or maybe I'm my whole entire life is nothing but a hologram, or I'm a part of the Matrix. All kinds of different skeptical scenarios that we could introduce. But the basic idea is that when we are thinking about different beliefs and different claims, there's a distinction between being absolutely certain that they are true and having some good reason to believe them, good reason to accept these things. So a skeptic might insist that you can never actually know anything with absolute certainty. And that might be true. But nonetheless, we can still have some reasons to believe it, right? So I have some reasons to believe that this computer exists in front of me, that the computer is sitting on the table. What reasons do I have? Well, it's based upon my sense perception. It's based upon the fact that I can reach out and touch it. I can hear things when I knock on them. So I've got these sense perception that allows me to make or form the belief that the external world exists. There's these external objects. I may not know that with absolute certainty, but I at least have some reason to accept it, some evidence to accept it. On the other hand, we've got this notion of agnosticism. Agnosticism comes from the Greek, where it's basically the claim that we don't really know, and it's separate from skepticism, because skepticism is essentially calling into question that whether or not we know something at all. Agnosticism is just saying, well, maybe we know, maybe we don't know. It's just sort of a position that doesn't quite take a stand on the issue. It's withholding judgment. And I think that that's another important point to keep in mind here as we're thinking about what we believe. Oftentimes, you as a student, you're going to be introduced to things that you've never even thought about before. And so you may find yourself as a kind of an agnostic with regard to some of these things. And that's fine. The idea here is simply that you're withholding judgment until you have better reasons, or until you've evaluated the evidence, or you've thought critically about the nuances involved with some of these positions that you could potentially take. So agnosticism is related to, it's similar to skepticism, but it's different because skepticism says, I don't know this, where agnosticism is saying, I have not yet formed a belief, or I have not yet considered all of the evidence. It's withholding judgment rather than saying, I don't know. So agnosticism is very similar to skepticism. In fact, you can consider it as a form of skepticism because you don't really know such and such, whatever that belief is. But here, I want you to understand this term agnosticism in terms of like withholding judgment. So you're still going through the process of evaluating the evidence and thinking critically about the different nuances involved. Now I want to introduce this term subjective relativism. It's another term that Vaughan introduces in the chapter, and there's different ways that we can understand this. On the one hand, sometimes people talk about relativism with regard to morality, right? Whether or not our moral claims are true just because some society or some group of people happen to believe it. Or maybe some culture happens to believe that murder is wrong, but other cultures think that murder is fine. That's a kind of subjective or cultural relativism. But what Vaughan is really getting at here is a way of thinking about truth in general. The idea that truth might be relative, that, what might be true for one person may not be true for another person. And that particular view is really dangerous. That particular view, I think it's rampant. A lot of people accept some version of this, but it's problematic in a lot of ways. So think about what would happen if subjective relativism was true. If that was true, then you could never be wrong about anything. That means that you would be infallible, right? You would have infallible knowledge about the world, because if what makes some particular claim true is simply the fact that you believe it, then everything you believe is true, right? Nothing you believe would ever be false. And that just seems to really, really kind of conflict with our experience of the world. Many times we believe things and we find out we're wrong about those things. And so we have to change those beliefs. Many times we come into contact with people that disagree with us. The very fact that there's disagreement seems to suggest that somebody's right and another person is mistaken. Otherwise, there would be no real disagreement in the first place. But subjective realism says that both people are right. Right, both claims are true, even though they might be in conflict in some sense or inconsistent. Now, there's this additional term that Vaughan introduces called social relativism. So let me try to explain what this means. What Vaughan says in the chapter is, to escape the difficulties of subjective relativism, some people posit social relativism, the view that truth is relative to societies, right? So here we're not talking about whether truth is subjective in terms of the individual. Rather, we're talking about it being subjective for the society. What makes some particular claim true or false is just the fact that whether the society believes it or rejects it. Again, we're going to introduce a kind of infallibilism for that society here. Vaughan goes on to claim that the claim is that the truth depends not on an individual's belief, but on society's belief. So a claim can be true for the Chinese, but false for Americans. True for college students, but false for public officials. True for Baptists, but false for atheists. To many, this kind of relativism, like subjective kind, also seems to render critical thinking superficious, right? So the basic idea here is whether we're talking about subjective relativism or social relativism, in either case, critical thinking is useless, right? There's no point in thinking critically because anything you believe would be true. Whether we're talking about subjective or social relativism, right? It would be impossible to have a belief that's false on this kind of view, which makes critical thinking basically useless. Insofar as critical thinking necessarily involves evaluating your beliefs to determine whether your beliefs are true or false, to consider the evidence because we might want to change our beliefs, trying to make good decisions based upon good beliefs and good reasons. But if social relativism is true, then every single choice you make is a good choice insofar as it's based upon a true belief, because your beliefs could never be false. And that would imply that you could never make a bad decision. All your decisions are always good ones. Again, that seems to, fly in the face of the way we experience the world. I know personally I've made bad decisions that I sort of regret, things that I wish I would have done otherwise. And maybe you're the same way. Maybe there's things in your life where you wish you had done something differently. But that would be impossible on these views because all your choices and all your decisions would be stemming from or grounded in these infallible beliefs that could never possibly be false. Now, sort of on the flip side of all this is what we might call deep global philosophical skepticism. Remember above when I was talking about skepticism, I was just talking about with regard to any particular belief, right? So you might be a skeptic with regard to whether or not climate change is real, or you might be a skeptic with regard to whether vaccines are, providing a benefit for society. So these are different claims or beliefs that one could be a skeptic about. But this notion of a deep global philosophical skepticism is where you're a skeptic about everything, right? You're a skeptic about literally every single claim that could be presented. This is the type of view where I was suggesting before, where you might be a brain in a vat. You might be living in the matrix, where literally every single thing in the world is false. So notice that this is different from the claim that you're a skeptic, insofar as you're not claiming that you don't know. Rather, you're claiming that everything you believe is false. You don't have any true beliefs. All your beliefs are false. So this is again sort of the flip side of subjective or social relativism. But here, instead of all your beliefs being true or infallible, all your beliefs are in air. It's sort of a global air theory with regard to what we take ourselves to know. And once again, if that was the case, then it looks like critical thinking would be useless. What's the point of doing any critical thinking or reasoning about our choices and our beliefs if everything is false? If it's really the case that everything we believe is just globally false because you're a brain in a vat or you're in the matrix, then who cares about critical thinking? Critical thinking is hinged on the idea that we could be wrong and the idea that we need to make good decisions based upon good reasons. But not, if none of that applies, then neither does critical thinking.